Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the good fortune of directing the Asia program here at the Wilson Center, and the particular good fortune today to host this program. We're being webcast, so our audience is not only those of you in this room, but others around the country and indeed around the world. That's important because I need to ask those of you who are in the room to cut off all your electronic devices because it plays havoc with the webcast. So if you have a cell phone, BlackBerry, iPod, most anything else, if you will cut it off, we'd be very grateful. Since we do have an audience beyond simply those in this room, allow me just to say one or two words about the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the nation's memorial to President Wilson. President Wilson had a distinguished career in academics prior to entering the political arena. And we at the Wilson Center try to focus on Woodrow Wilson's twin passions, sound scholarship and public policy. On a good day, we like to at least hope that good scholarship can help produce good policy, and good policy can help inform good scholarship. So that's a bit of who we are. This event today is sponsored not only by the Asia program, but by the Wilson Center's new Kissinger Institute. We created the Kissinger Institute in the middle of last year for the study of China and U.S.-Chinese relations. The Kissinger Institute is run by Stapleton Roy, a name to many of you familiar in this room. Ambassador Roy had a exceptionally distinguished career as an American diplomat, serving as ambassador in a number of countries, including in China. Unfortunately for us, Stape Roy is in China today, attending a conference commemorating the 30th anniversary of the normalization of relations between the U.S. and the PRC. But Bruce, he asked me to send you his regards, and he's, for all I know, he's perhaps watching this right now if he's got jet lag and can't be sleeping. We are here to hear Bruce talk about his new book. Bruce was a fellow here at the Wilson Center a few years ago and wrote much of the book while he was here. So this is something of a homecoming for Bruce, but it's also one of those events which gives us particular pleasure since we in some way feel we have a bit of responsibility for this book. Some of you may notice as you came in the room that you can get copies of the book to buy when you leave the room. You get a small discount by buying it here. So I urge all of you to buy so many copies that Bruce runs out of ink in inscribing them for you. All right, we'll get started. Bruce Dixon is professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He was, as I've already indicated, a fellow here several years ago. His work has focused on politics, political reform, economics, and the relationship between economics and the political system in the People's Republic of China. This is, by my count, your third book, Bruce?
Yes.
Yes. Two earlier books looked at democratization in China and Taiwan, and the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and private entrepreneurs in China. I think in some way this book is a follow-on to his 2003 book called Red Capitalists in China. Bruce, we're delighted to welcome you back and turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank all of you for coming here today. As Bob mentioned, the book was written when I was here as a visiting fellow for a year, and it's proved to be a very ideal place to sit and spend a year doing nothing but write every day. Bob was a very gentle steward as director of the Asia program, so I was grateful for the time to be here and grateful for the opportunity to come back today and share with you the results of that, the time that I spent here and then the book that was the consequence of it. As Bob mentioned, the book that just came out I'm talking about today is a sequel of sorts to the book of a few years ago called Red Capitalists, and looks at the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and private entrepreneurs in the country. China has had a sustained period of rapid economic development, and over the past 10 or so years, rapid privatization of the economy. And with that rapid growth and the privatization, there's been expectations that political change will also be a consequence of it, based on the idea that economic development promotes political change, and that privatization in the economy also leads to liberalization of the political sphere. The notion that in time the discrepancy between the authoritarian political regime and the more open economy will come into closer sync. This assumption that liberalization and growth is leading to political change is based upon a couple of assumptions that, as I'll describe here, have not yet borne fruit. It assumes, on the one hand, that the Chinese Communist Party is a passive actor in this process. As Samuel Huntington wrote a number of years ago, that one of the main threats to an authoritarian regime is the rise of a group of people with an independent control over economic wealth, in other words, the formation of a capitalist class. And so the rise of a capitalist class in China is seen by some as being a potential threat to the regime there. But instead, the Chinese Communist Party has, in a variety of ways, embraced the private sector. On the one hand, it's given increased rhetorical support to the private economy and the private entrepreneurs, in the party's own rhetoric and its constitution. The guiding ideology of the party was changed back in 2001 so that the party doesn't simply represent the workers, the peasants, and soldiers, the so-called three revolutionary classes of the past, but now also represents what euphemistically is described as the advanced productive forces, in other words, for the economic elites, the capitalists of the country. So that rather than seeing them as class enemies of the Maoist period, they are now seen as a group that the party represents and promotes. The party has also encouraged its own members to go into the private sector, whether they were former officials or just rank-and-file party members, encouraged to open businesses as an example to other people that doing so would not be construed as criminal behavior as it had in the past, but also to show by example that the party was committed to rising prosperity as a key part of its agenda. It has also co-opted successful entrepreneurs into the party as a way of integrating them closer into the regime as it is, both into the party and, as I'll talk a little bit later, into other political positions in the country. It has also embraced the private sector through institutional ties, officially formed and sanctioned business associations that are headed by local party and government leaders, but that allow the private sector and the state to interact, especially at the local level, and also through the traditional means of creating a network of party cells throughout many of the private firms in the country as a way of getting the party directly into the private sector. The notion that privatization is leading to democratization in China also assumes that capitalists are inherently pro-democratic. And this is based upon the old or the traditional view of democratization in Europe, in which capitalists there were a force for change and compelled the crown in many European countries to gradually open up the political system become more responsive to business interests in the cities, Barrington Moore's famous phrase of no bourgeois, no democracy sort of captures that notion of sort of an inherent conflict of interest between capitalists and autocratic governments, and that capitalists are inherently forces for democratic change. But China, like many late developers, the relationship between government and business has been quite different. Been much more cooperation between government and business. The government is committed to economic development the way that early European countries were not, or earlier governments in Europe were not. And there's also a closer shared set of identities between government and business. As I mentioned, many of the leading capitalists in the country came out of the state, had former positions in the party or in the government. There are close family ties between many political leaders and business leaders, shared social and professional backgrounds, and most importantly, a shared commitment to economic growth as the key task, both for, this is why people are into business, for their own personal prosperity, and the government's committed to economic development as a key source of its legitimacy and popular support. These shared identities and common interests create a commitment to the status quo. The entrepreneurs have been the main beneficiaries of the party's economic reforms and privatization, and have little incentive to prefer democracy over the system in which they have prospered. The consequence is a set of stable set of relationships that I refer to as crony communism, sort of a play on the more familiar crony capitalism that was prominent in Korea, Southeast Asia, and to some extent Russia during its transition. But I'll talk about, for the rest of my talk, there's distinctive aspects of it in China, still a cozy relationship between capitalists and the government, but distinctive in ways given that China is still a communist country. The basis for the book and for the comments I'll be making today is a series of surveys that was done in China in 1999 and 2005. The survey was done in 8 different counties, 2 counties from 4 different provinces, chosen to represent a variety of different levels of economic development in the country. The survey included local party and government officials in each of the counties, some county-level officials, some grassroots leaders, and also involved medium and large-scale enterprises in these 8 communities. The idea that this survey, therefore, represented the economic and political elites of these communities, not necessarily a random sample of the private sector, because I did not include the smaller mom-and-pop type shops that are not seen as promoters of change, but the larger scale, more influential enterprises. And so this is kind of the backdrop for what the core of the book and what I'll be talking about today. So what is crony communism? First of all, it's dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. The party initiated the economic reforms in China without pressure from the capitalists. In fact, capitalists did not exist before the economic reforms began. And party and government officials themselves have been the main beneficiaries of economic reform. On the one hand, there is a group of people that I have dubbed as Shanghai entrepreneurs. These are people who were formerly in the party and government before going into business. Shanghai is the euphemism for going into business. Literally means jumping into the sea, but in this case means jumping out of the state into the private sector. They were encouraged during the 80s and 90s to take the lead in getting rich as an example to the rest of society. And they did this often through sweetheart deals, somewhat corrupt ties with local officials where they were able to either privatize a state-owned enterprise or somehow gain assets that they could operate as a private enterprise. This allows them to convert their political power that they had as members of the party into economic wealth. At the same time, there was a separate group of people who were able to turn their economic wealth into political power by being co-opted into the party because of their economic success. These two groups of different types of capitalists or their ties to the Communist Party, whether they were in the party before going into business or afterwards, helps explain some of the key differences between private firms in China. Party members have definite advantages in business, both the size of their firms, whether measured in terms of their annual sales or the number of workers they employ, much larger for private enterprise, for red capitalists, whether they're co-opted or were in the party beforehand, than are people who were not members of the Communist Party. You can see here from the two surveys that in general the size of the enterprises of private firms in China has grown dramatically. Not just the number of firms have grown, but the size of them has also grown between the two periods of the survey covered, but that the advantage given to party members remains constant even with that rapid growth. Ironically, as we'll talk about later on, people who are not in the party do not readily admit that party members have an advantage in business, despite the size difference of the firms. People who are not in the party don't always agree that they have party membership itself provides advantages. One of the other key differences, as I mentioned about the close family ties, many of the most prominent capitalists in China are sons and daughters or sons-in-law of high-level party leaders, where it used to be quite common for the sons and daughters of high-level party, military, and government leaders to follow their fathers, sometimes their mothers, into official jobs. For the leaders of the so-called third and fourth generation of leaders, those from the 1990s to the present, none of their children have gone into official careers. They've all gone into business. There is one report that was allegedly from the Central Party School that around 90% of China's multimillionaires were sons and daughters of party officials, which creates this very close link between big business and the state in China. In addition, the party's supervision over the private sector is done by the United Front Department, which was originally created as a way of linking the party with non-party elites in the country, and that remains a key part of its job. So that even though China no longer pursues the Marxist goals of promoting a socialist utopia in the future, it remains very much a Leninist system in the sense that the Communist Party is not only the key political player in the country, even the economy. Party members have large advantages and a very prominent role. Second aspect of crony communism is that it's decentralized. The collusion between the party and capitalists occurs more at the local level than at the very top level leadership. Unlike in Southeast Asia or Indonesia in particular, where much of these ties of cronyism were really with the ruling family and then was concentrated within that very small circle of people. In China, it's very decentralized, involving officials at all levels of government. These local officials have an incentive to have these close ties with business because their political careers are tied to the economic success of their communities. And since most of the economic development in China comes from the private sector, local officials have a distinct incentive to cooperate with officials, with capitalists, as a way of currying favor with local leaders. It's quite common for local businessmen to provide bribes for getting licenses and contracts. provide favors to their family, tuition abroad for their children, for example, or apartments or cars and so on. In some cases, jobs in their businesses, all of ways of sort of solidifying this tie between the two sets of elites. The third aspect of crony communism is that it's a diffuse set of relationships. Unlike in Russia, where wealth was concentrated in the hands of just a very small number of capitalists, a set of oligarchs, as they became to be known, the beneficiaries of privatization in China are very widespread. A much larger number of private businessmen in the country. The economy is dominated by small and medium-scale enterprises, not the very large integrated firms that Russia experienced. One consequence of this is that it's difficult to engage in collective action among capitalists because the numbers are just so vast. They easily engage in lobbying to pursue their business interest, but they have not typically been involved in collective action in pursuit of political change. 1989 was, of course, the exception when several business people promptly supported the demonstrators. More recently, there's been an individual support for academic conferences, publications, these type of things that also promote or publicized public policy and political change, but these tend to be the exceptions rather than the rule. The main trend for capitalists in China is to limit their activities, their collective activities, to strictly business issues and not engage in broader public discussions of political matters. A fourth key aspect of what I describe as crony communism is that it is an expansive system. In other words, the number of red capitalists have grown dramatically during the period of economic reform in China. Is a simple bar graph to show that, unfortunately, the white letters on a light blue background don't help you see very much. But on the left-hand side of the graph, in 1993, 13% of private entrepreneurs were members of the Communist Party. In 2007, 38% were members of the party. In contrast, about 6% of the overall population are members of the Communist Party. Among private entrepreneurs, the concentration is 38%. So a much closer integration, absorption of this sector of society into the party than is true for most other social sectors. This growth in the number of red capitalists has mostly been through the privatization of state-owned enterprises. The managers of former SOEs were typically party members before their firms are privatized. They automatically become red capitalists once it becomes a private firm. But there's also some growth in the number of co-opted entrepreneurs. Not the big surge that was expected in 2001 when Jiang Zemin announced the Three Represents slogan that I mentioned before, lifted the ban on recruiting entrepreneurs. There was an expectation of a large surge of new membership into the party as a consequence, but that proved not to be forthcoming. In terms of its recruitment of capitalists, the party has a very clear strategy. It tends to go after the largest firms, just as in its policy towards reform of SOEs, the label being to grasp the large and to release the small. It has the same approach to how it interacts with the private sector. It goes after the owners of the largest, most prominent private firms to recruit members, to build party cells, and doesn't pay as much attention to the smaller scale enterprises. Within my survey of the medium and large scale entrepreneurs, the number of red capitalists grew from 38% in the first survey to exactly 50% in the second one. When it's broken down, though, by when they joined the party, the biggest increase, as I mentioned, was from the so-called Shanghai entrepreneurs that were already in the party to begin with. There's some growth among co-opted people, but the big surge, the big growth in the number of red capitalists came through privatization. In business, as in other careers in China, there's a glass ceiling for those who are not in the party. Party membership gives economically and especially politically ambitious entrepreneurs an incentive to join the party. According to local officials, the main reason that entrepreneurs join the party is because they want to get involved in politics. In order to be nominated and to be elected to local legislators, for example, being a party member is almost a requirement for doing so. And so much of from the perspective of local officials, this is the main reason to join, is because you want to get involved in politics, want to use your economic success to have some degree of political influence. Within the relatively small group of people who have been elected to local legislatures in China, those who are red capitalists are by far the largest number. In the first row there of the Shanghai entrepreneurs, that number has grown by almost 50% between the period of the two surveys, which indicates the party has had a more coherent strategy for who it nominates for these different types of positions. The numbers of co-opted entrepreneurs and those who are not in the party, the percentage of those people who have held elected positions has declined over time, in part either because of their own lack of interest or more likely because the party's strategy has become more coherent over time. This is also true for people who have been involved in village-level elections in the countryside. A similar trend here where those who have been candidates in local elections, a rapid, dramatic increase in the percentage of them who were in the party before going into business, whereas the percentages of other types of entrepreneurs has gone down over time. So even here, the capitalists who are now holding political positions in the country are held by people who were very embedded within the party before going to business. These are not new sets of interests getting involved in the political system, but in some ways a circulation of people who are already in the elite and are now being chosen as business leaders, even though they had close ties to begin with. Another key aspect of crony communism is that it is a paternalistic system. In other words, local party leaders think one of their key jobs is to teach businessmen how to be better businessmen. Little confidence that they know how to do their jobs well. These are people who are not born and raised within the family business, and therefore it's up to local leaders to train them, to school them, to supervise them in ways that will benefit the local economy as well as benefit their local firms. On the one hand, they do this through building party organizations within firms, and as you can see here that the private firms with party cells within them, a key attribute of a Leninist system, are primarily the ones that are owned and operated by red capitalists. They're also the firms in which the party has been able to recruit new members from among the workforce. So one way the party has supervised the private sector is through this traditional means of party building. A second way of doing so is through opening party schools to businessmen. Both the Central Party School in Beijing and local party schools frequently now have classes that are specifically for businessmen. And to some degree, there's a little bit of political education that goes along with it, but for the most part, they emphasize basic accounting, human resources, marketing type techniques to promote their businesses. And this is seen as being necessary for businessmen. It's seen as helping promote the local economy and therefore of interest to local officials, which gets to the next aspect of crony communism, which is that it's a symbiotic relationship, which means that both sides are benefiting from the relationship. These cozy ties that have built up over the years have benefited both the party as well as the private sector. Both benefit from promoting economic development and from privatization. And they also have shared values, shared policy preferences on a number of key policy issues. One of which has to do with the pace of reform. And as you can see here, if you on the left-hand side, the views of entrepreneurs about whether the pace of economic reform is too fast, about right, or too slow. And on the right-hand side, the views of cadres on that issue. And as you can see, almost a complete correspondence between the two groups of people, and that the change over time has also gone in the direction where both the local political and economic elites think that the pace of economic reform is about right. So the same trends among both sets of people. On the issue of whether political reform should be initiated by the party and government alone, or whether society, and especially economic leaders, should have a role in that process, there's a similar change over time, that a preference that the political reform process, or put it the other way around. Over time, the people who agree that the party alone should initiate reform has declined, and the number of people who think that society should play a role, especially that economic leaders should play a role, has increased, both among entrepreneurs, which would seem obvious. They have an incentive in doing so, but also among local officials. There's also been a clear trend in favor of letting society and especially business leaders play a role in their process. The third example has to do with the preference of growth over political stability as key policy goals. Obviously, you want to have both economic growth and political stability, but if you had to pick one over the other, which would you prefer? As you can see here, that the percentage of entrepreneurs who favor growth over stability was less than half and fairly stable between the two surveys, but a sharp decline in the percentage of cadres who also preferred growth over stability, which would indicate some convergence of views between the two groups. But when they're broken down into their different subgroups, the real difference is the county level cadres who remain committed to rapid economic development, even at the expense of some political instability. That's because their incentives are to promote economic development as their key task. Local officials who are on the front line of protests and who are tasked with maintaining order, as you can see from the lowest line of this table here, are much less committed to rapid growth if it leads to instability. Their concern, as it is for the entrepreneurs, is much more about stability as a key goal rather than growth itself. This follows from the period from the past 10 years or so, where the number of public protests, often about the consequence of economic growth, has skyrocketed in China. And so it's reflected in the views of local officials who are concerned about maintaining order, even at the expense of slightly slower growth. As a consequence of this, because this set of relationships is dominated by the CCP, is decentralized within the political hierarchy, diffuse within the private sector, has been growing in numbers in terms of the numbers of entrepreneurs drawn into the political arena. This could be a self-perpetuating system. Rather than be a threat to the CCP, private entrepreneurs have shown themselves to be a key base of support for the party. So even though the party no longer adheres to Marxism, no longer pursues the strictly communist goals of the past, it clearly remains a Leninist system where the party has monopoly on political power. And even though the party no longer represents simply the traditional revolutionary classes, it still upholds many of the party's traditions and symbols, excuse me, as seen here. So the party still uses the hammer and sickle as its symbol, but as this cartoon shows, with a slightly different meaning than it used to have. This cartoon was originally published in a Hong Kong newspaper, and I use it for the cover of my book with the permission of the cartoonist, because I thought it just, I'm a tenured professor, I don't have to worry about it being too flippant. So the fact that it's sort of this whimsical look, but nevertheless symbolizes that close integration between economic wealth on the one hand and political power on the other, does a nice job of simply carrying that through quite well. So last, what are the policy implications of all this? And I would argue there are two, neither of which are particularly novel, but both of which I think are important. Well, before I get into that, what could I said it was a self-perpetuating system, but what could make that change? One would be a decline of the party's pro-business policies. Under recent years, the party leadership has pursuing what is seen as being a more populist set of policies to balance off the pro-business, pro-growth policies of the past. That could upset this relationship between party and the private sector if it went too far along, but it doesn't seem to be doing so. And in the recent months of economic stagnation, of slower growth in the past, the party has sort of eased up on its environmental policies, eased up on some of its pro-labor policies as a way of further promoting business and growth. So its previous commitment to more sort of left-oriented populist policies has now been moderated. That would also be a challenge to this relationship. The emergence of a true market economy in China would also undermine the relationship, because capitalists would not need to have the strong support of local officials to be successful in business. The more that they depend on official support, the more they have to be part of this crony communist system. And lastly, a dramatic increase in corruption would also undermine support. As it is, most businessmen see corruption as sort of a tolerable and necessary part of doing business. If local leaders became too predatory in their demands, ways that undermine business, that would also be a challenge to this set of relationships. And it could be a victim of its own success. As I mentioned before, as the public comes to believe that the key to success in business is political ties and connections, and not through hard work and skill, it may undermine support for the party's set of economic reform policies as a whole, which is why it began trying to promote some of these populist policies of recent years to try and resolve some of those tensions. So finally, the policy implications. This is a view that scholars have long recognized and is increasingly part of, I think, policy circles as well, that economic growth alone does not produce democracy. And in fact, the CCP's goal or its hope is that by promoting economic development, it will extend its time and power, not threaten it. So therefore, promoting prosperity in China in and of itself does not guarantee political change there. And lastly, that capitalists are not inherently Democrats, and therefore that promoting economic privatization is not a fast track toward democratization of the country. That the experience of China shows that relations between government and business, especially between the private sector, in fact can solidify support for the authoritarian regime and not necessarily pose a challenge to it. Okay, thank you very much, and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Let me ask the first question, if I may, and my question is prompted by a newspaper article in today's Washington Post. The article suggested that you briefly touched on it just 2 or 3 minutes ago. An unregulated, unchecked capitalism, such as seen in parts of China today, can lead to social problems. Workers not getting paid, workers being cheated in other ways, layoffs, loss of the social safety net associated with state-owned enterprises. And the press reports, not simply in today's report, but in some time now, have suggested an eroding situation in terms of social problems, which stem at least in part from unchecked capitalism. If this goes on at some length, some people argue this will really increase the dangers of political instability in China. How does this fit into your overall thesis? Now, I understand that you have focused on sort of capitalism from the top down, the red capitalists. Look at it from the bottom up. If you were writing this book today, knowing about the recent slowdown in growth, the rise of political discontent because of these problems, would you have concluded anything differently? Does it affect your story at all?
This tension between, on the one hand, promoting growth as well as protecting society from the consequences of that growth, I think has been a part of the current leadership's agenda since they came into power in 2002. They recognize that one of the key reasons for the rise of popular protests during the 90s and into the early part of this century, this decade, was the corruption, the land grabs, as well as the layoffs and the unfulfilled commitments by both the state but also by private business to the welfare of society. And so they began to focus, on the one hand, at least rhetorically, talk about the need of benefiting society as a whole from these policies and not just letting the fat cats get richer and richer. It seems to have worked in the sense that a larger share of the population believes the country is going in the right direction. There is a survey that came out last summer by the Pew Group, a global survey that showed that about 85% of Chinese thought the country is moving in the right direction, more than double what it was 5 years before that, and a lot higher than people in the United States who thought the same thing. So the top leadership is aware of that public discontent and is trying to find ways of not making society pay the full price for unchecked economic development. Probably the recent melamine scare within China, I think, really brought that into focus, that these were often well-connected and reputable companies that were selling this tainted milk. that has also led to an outcry and a demand for increased regulation. As long as the state responds to it in ways, it can preempt more demands for change. So for a couple years ago, when there was the media coverage of people that were being kept in slavery in factories building bricks, one response to that was a very rapid passage of the labor law that had been pending in Parliament for so long. Now I think with the melamine scare, there's a need to regulate more effectively industry in that way as well, without at the same time undermining the rate of growth. And so I think they have this tension between, on the one hand, promoting business, promoting growth on the one hand, without sacrificing social welfare as a whole. This is a problem that almost any government faces when it's committed to both economic development and social welfare. China's been, it's a shifting balance between the two. But I think so far that the leadership has been trying to strike that uneven, unstable balance between the two in ways to kind of preempt more social demands for more open institutions and more open policy process that really would challenge the party's authority.
Good. Okay, we'll turn it over to you. I would ask you to identify yourself, wait till Sue gets the mic to you, and keep your comments or your questions briefly. I saw the corner. There we are. And then here next.
Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. I have a comment about your two assumptions. First is you say CCP is a passive actor. I think CPP is an active actor. Without the active actor of CPP, you cannot have your data now. And second is this, you say capitalists are pro-democracy. And we just look at last year's slide. You see, capitalists are not necessarily democratic. And particularly the current American problem is because due to the capitalists are not Democrat. They are corrupt and they are greedy. Thank you.
Thanks for raising that, and I apologize if I wasn't clear in my comments. These are not my assumptions. These are assumptions that other people make about the prospects for change in China, and what I was trying to show was exactly what you said. The party has not been a passive actor, that China's capitalists are not democratic. I agree completely.
So you can bring it back down here.
Excuse me. I'm Victor Basso, consultant in national security policy. One thing I'm wondering about, how viable this system is. Does it evolve in any direction? Is there an element of evolution? Or is this a frozen system where balancing acts exist and not moving anywhere? Because if it is evolving into something, then we got to know what is it evolving into, and either support that evolution or try to oppose it externally by one means or another. If it is a stable system, then there isn't much we can do except interact with that system. So do you have any, in your research, did you get any notion what is it is evolving into, if it is evolving into something?
It's a very good question, and obviously this is a snapshot, or I guess two snapshots from 2 points where I've taken these surveys of local leaders, which shows that over time I think the relationship has been getting closer and closer, more integration in different ways, in ways I think that could be stable if not forever, at least for years to come. One of the big question marks for this relationship, as well as for the CCP's continue to rule as a whole, is whether or not these rapid rates of economic growth can be sustained. And as we're seeing now, maybe not. It may not be going into recession the way the U.S. and other countries are, but even if it slows to 5 or 6% growth, that may not be enough to sustain either this relationship or the party's safe position in power. That's been a concern they've had all along, and they don't really necessarily have a solution to that. They've been hoping to avoid the problem, but now the ripple effects of the global economy are now being felt within China. Much of the people who are being hurt by it are the kind of the smaller scale firms that are not tied in, they're not members of the party, they're not tied in with the local elites as much. But as a whole, jobs are being lost locally, local economies are suffering. So I think there is an effort to try and promote growth immediately, the way there is an attempt in this country to try and jumpstart the economy again, in ways I think is largely going to be beneficial to this relationship. But as I mentioned in response to Bob's question, there is obviously concern now that the private sector cannot be completely unregulated the way it has been in the past. For that matter, many of the larger firms in the country would welcome better regulation, because the actions of some of these smaller fly-by-night companies that tarnish the reputation of otherwise high-quality brands in the country. So I don't think that increased regulation necessarily undermines the relationship between the private sector and the ruling party. Increasing a little more certainty and a clear environment, I think, would be welcomed by most of them. What it means in the long run, that's always the big question.
Before you venture down that road, you ought to charge some sort of consulting fee.
That's right. That's right. I don't look too far ahead, because I think most people, many China scholars for years and years and years have anticipated that the system as it is cannot survive the way it is, and yet it has adapted in small, sometimes subtle ways to keep itself in power. I think not a consensus, but I think more China specialists have come to recognize that this is a system that's not necessarily in transition to anything else. It is relatively stable, in part because it's been able to adapt enough to respond to these kinds of pressures.
Go over this side. David? Wait for Sue. She'll be there in just a second. We want to give her a workout.
David Grease, and thank you, Bruce, for a very clear presentation. I have two interrelated questions. You commented that some observers say that up to 90% of the wealthiest entrepreneurs are princelings, children and relatives of high officials. And my question there is, does anyone have any idea what percent of China's wealth this group, the Taizedong, control? Say a percent of GDP. Second question is, there's frequently commentary that for others to enter into that sphere, the very top of the entrepreneurial sphere, there are barriers if relationships with officials aren't enjoyed, or party membership, what have you. How extensive do you think those barriers are if you see them as existing? In other words, is this a closed club?
Mm-hmm. Two very good questions. It'll be easier to answer the second one than the first, so I'll do the first one. We really don't know, because obviously this is the kind of information that would be quite inflammatory were it to be known. The report that I mentioned about 90% of the multimillionaires being the kids of high-ranking officials was leaked through a Hong Kong newspaper, not widely known but not publicly available within China, because it's just embarrassing. I tasked my RA last year to go through the Politburo and see what their kids are doing. You know, what careers are their kids in? You can only find about a handful of information of Politburo members that had information about their kids. So even there's still a bit of secrecy about what family members are doing, but the ones that we know of have all gone into business or married into business. And so both daughters of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao both married very prominent, very wealthy businessmen. That in some ways goes against their populist images, but nevertheless is indicative of this relationship between politics and economics in the country. The second question about is, was it a closed system or not? This gets into some of the minutia about how do you become a candidate for elected office. For local legislatures, local people's congresses, most candidates or all candidates are screened by local party committees before they're allowed to actually be candidates and run for election. Most of them are party members or nominated by the party. In some cases, they're also nominated by local business associations that themselves are quasi-governmental in nature. Without that support, getting a nomination is extremely difficult. There is some openness to it, but not a whole lot. The party really controls who can be candidates in elections and who can, assuming they win the election, can actually take the seat in the legislature or for village and township elections actually assume executive office. There has not been much effort to challenge that closed system and to create sort of a organized or at least loosely affiliated opposition movement in the country. It has not been the practice or the attempt to try and gain political influence in terms of an opposition through the means of elections. So I think in that sense it is very much a closed system.
So let's go back over here.
I have two questions. One is you talk about the close tie between the entrepreneurs and the Communist Party. So how private is China's private sector? First question. And the second question is about your policy implication. You talk about promoting prosperity in China will not guarantee political change. Based on my own personal observation, China has opened up a lot more compared with the past. And we're not, if China continue to open up, eventually lead to some kind of democracy, or maybe not pure democracy, maybe some sort of more representative form of government. In the long run, it may take time, but it will be there. We'll get there sometime.
Let's see. I was so focused on your second question, I've now forgotten the first one. Tell me again. Oh, how private the economy really is. That is extremely murky issue. It used to be quite clear. You had state-owned enterprises, you had collectively owned enterprises, and you had private. When they began reforming, the euphemism was reform of the state-owned enterprises. They don't want to call it privatizing them because that was too politically sensitive. So they referred to it as reform. You now have this mix of ownership forms that are not clearly state or private. So there's a lot of overlap between these two sectors. They're not clearly completely state-owned. There's some amount of stocks that are sold or some investment by non-state actors. To what extent the state still has control of them is difficult to tell from firm to firm. And even the government statistics on this are very difficult to tease out. A number of years ago, they changed the way they report these numbers. So it's no longer just the number of firms in these different ownership sectors, but only firms above a certain level of I forget whether it's sales or fixed assets, but only large firms are now reported. It's basically we don't know. Even when I try to find simple numbers of how large is the private sector, how much does it contribute to the economy, there's a wide range of estimates, often even from the Chinese media give different numbers about the importance of the private economy in the overall economy. So the simple answer is it's growing and it's getting, more important, getting larger. How big it is, that we don't know precisely that issue. Where this is leading towards a more representative system, and this is kind of the hope, I guess, that countries that are going through this process of economic change and development eventually leads to demands for greater representation. So far, the CCP's been able to preempt those types of sustained demands against it. Whether it continues to be able to do so will depend upon how well it can govern effectively without those types of representative institutionalized channels. Under the current leadership, they've been trying to find ways of gaining more feedback from the public in ways that I think outside scholars and many people within China don't always see as being very meaningful. For example, the local People's Political Consultative Conferences, largely appointed bodies, sort of large-scale advisory groups, could be very influential as a way of gaining some opinion about policy matters before they get implemented, or a sense of public opinion in the absence of elections or other types of more public data. And there's been a lot of attention and a lot of resources given to these local bodies. Whether they actually make a difference is hard to say. In general, I think the lessons from other countries is that you can sustain a stable political system despite ongoing economic development. The Chinese Communist Party is hoping it will be able to do so without putting constraints on its authority. It has defied predictions of its demise for the last 20 or more years. Lots of people used to think it was every sign of protest was an indication that the regime was going to collapse. And in fact, it has not. Those predictions have been way off the mark. Whether it can open up a little bit on the political side without a stronger push for more openness, we simply don't know, because the party's been unwilling to even raise expectations of that type of liberalization for fear that the outcome would be another surge of protest as happened in the 1980s.
Right behind you, Sue. Jill.
I'm Jill Shankleman. I'm a visiting scholar here. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I hope it's not a diversion, but I wonder if you can help me. I kept hearing the phrase Confucian capitalism. People keep telling me that this is what they think they have in China, and I have no idea what it means, and if it does mean anything, does it make any sense?
One of the paradoxes of development in China as well as East Asia as a whole is that it used to be seen, 100 years ago, that Confucianism was the obstacle to development. You had to get rid of it in order to have modernization. Now, as a result of the East Asian NICs, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, that seem to have retained some of their Confucian values despite modernization, that in fact there may be certain aspects of Confucian traditions that are not just compatible with development, but maybe even support it. The notion of sort of a collective sense of identity. So you're identifying with the firm or the country as a whole, not your own simple private interests. May be part of that, although, what has allowed the Chinese economy to prosper and what allowed most capitalists to prosper is the pursuit of their self-interest, not necessarily the larger collective well-being. A deference to authority is a key part of Confucian traditions, and that seems to be not inconsistent with what we see in China as well as other countries in the past. The degree to which the current leadership is promoting Confucian values and really sincerely believes in resurrecting some of those traditions after having spent decades trying to eliminate them, whether that's a sincere effort or a more strategic effort to try and find ways of replacing its traditional ideology with some other set of values to keep it looking legitimate in the eyes of the people. I'm not the person to answer the question. My notion is that it's part of China's efforts to look abroad more friendly by building Confucian institutes in the U.S. as well as other countries among its own people to look like it's more rooted in the country's traditions and history, whether or not exactly how important it is, I simply don't know. There have been a variety of books published in China to find about both foreign successful businessmen, Confucian ideas about business, as well as other social groups not indigenous to China. Exactly how important those ideas are, as opposed to simply more basic self-interest, it's hard for me to say.
May I answer that question?
Yes.
Okay.
Sue, why don't you bring the microphone down? Yeah. And then we'll go to you next.
Qiao Chen again. Yeah, this is the first time I heard this term, but I would like to say is this: what's Confucius? The basic is this: a person should have a self-discipline, and also he should have a social responsibility. So if based on this, and I think that's good, and that should be, and also the U.S. capitalists to change to Confucius capitalism. Thank you.
Milton Kotler. I'm an American businessman who's been in China doing business for 10 years, and I write frequently for the China Business Press on management and business issues. Your book, I really praise your book because I see it as a very helpful antidote to the beating of a dead horse, namely the journalistic and public policy focus on whether China will become more democratic or not. This is the total preoccupation we have. So can you answer this very puzzling question to me? I have seen the evolution of China over 10 years to great prosperity. So it's a very dynamic system. China's stability and economic growth have been very helpful to the U.S., to the tune of $3 trillion now in China-held assets, not to public assets, debt, and Fannie Mae, not to mention private wealth derived from Chinese business. Why is there no public policy focus or journalistic attention to explicate this covert level of relationship that we have had with China? You don't get to $3 trillion of debt, like that. It has taken years. It has taken private negotiations with the Treasury and with federal. God knows. I don't know because I never see any coverage of the covert dependence of the U.S. on China's economic development and stability. All I see is the journalistic opposition and critique against China for not being more democratic and representative. So we have a bi-level situation. We have an overt opposition to China based on democracy. We have a very complex and secret, I don't know. I know bits and pieces, but we have an intricate, covert relationship that has resulted in a great bilateral economic relationship and mutual dependency between China. So how can we move from what I call this dead horse of democracy to some practical attention to how we can, in policy, pragmatically advance our mutual interest on the basis of Chinese economic development and stability? That's my puzzle.
I think the amount of Chinese purchase of American debt, whether private debt or government debt, is fairly well known, and it's not done through covert, secretive processes. Both the government as well as the Chinese government as well as Chinese investors have been buying up large amounts of U.S. bonds and other types of debt as a way of funneling, of fueling the budget deficits that have arisen in the past couple of years in this country. And there's a recognition that without China's buying of those debts and those bonds, that interest rates would be higher and everything else.
Bruce, excuse me for interrupting. It is not a Adam Smith magic hat. I know, in fact, that every month the Bank of China comes here and works out exactly how much of the auction bonds China will purchase. So there are negotiations, not a magic hand of a free market buying in China buying up U.S. debt.
No, I'm not suggesting it's an.
So who is explaining to us the benefit of the process and benefits of this actual negotiation and mutual exchange, economic exchange?
Well, I guess there's not enough. Who has the incentive to publicize that more aggressively than it has been done? I think most people are familiar with the practice and familiar with the large amount of debt.
No one in this room knows how China has accumulated, how many arms have been twisted to buy 1% or 0% bonds. This is so political. And it is, there's politics and business involved in this. I'm a businessman. I don't believe in magic hands, free markets, and all that. These are negotiated relationships. Journalists should seek truth, should tell the truth. Why not talk about or investigate this so the American people can balance, at least, their commitment to democracy as an ideology to the benefits of economic and mutual relationship with China on a pragmatic and non-ideological basis.
Well, maybe that's a question that's better placed not to scholars, but to journalists who, according to your analysis, they're not covering it. Bruce, is this the topic of your next book?
No, it's not, unfortunately. I have to say that I don't. Even though I study the relationship between the capitalists and the party in the country, my real interest has been in what keeps the party in power. And so on this issue, I'm aware of the growing amount of debt controlled by China, American debt controlled by China. My economist friends say it's not, from their perspective, not a real issue. It's not a control over the American economy. It's beneficial to the American economy. Why worry about it? And so I don't.
If it's a benefit, why not have more benefit?
I think the U.S. has not stopped China from buying more. I think what's happened in the last few months is that China's tried to diversify where it's sending its cash reserves to not be so dependent on the U.S. economy. I think their concern is being drawn down by the American economy as it has its problems. So it wants to diversify to Europe and elsewhere, the way any good investor wants to diversify their risk. Beyond that, I don't know the ins and outs, the monthly schedule of the Chinese bankers that come over here to negotiate this stuff. Where it happens, I don't follow it very much.
Your book is handy.
Thank you very much.
We have maybe time for one more question in the back.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What more would you say, how are you viewing the role of Hong Kong, and any difference it was making, particularly before the handover in '97?
In terms of what? Hong Kong's impact on what?
Well, particularly, I'm thinking particularly relations between capitalists and communists.
Much of Hong Kong's involvement in China has largely been in South China. There has been, again, a mutual interest of promoting foreign investment, technically foreign investment from Hong Kong into China, tax incentives to encourage that type of thing. Much of the manufacturing in Hong Kong and Taiwan, for that matter, has been moved to the mainland where the cheap labor resides. So if anything, the economic ties between China and all of its neighbors has increased dramatically over the past 10 years. Different countries, I'm not sure about Hong Kong in particular, but many countries have talked about the concern about being too tied, too dependent on the Chinese economy. But you know, the economic incentives are all towards more investment, more interaction, and I think, especially for Hong Kong, that remains the case. But I think the transition after '97, where Hong Kong is no longer a British colony but is it's referred to as a special administrative region of China, it has not harmed Hong Kong in the sense of that its economy is still vibrant, but it has not been the people who expected full and immediate autonomy were obviously very disappointed by that, and that doesn't seem to be any prospect of change in that regard. I think China wants to keep control over the political arena within Hong Kong while allowing business to operate relatively freely.
Well, thanks, Bruce. We're at the end of our allotted time here. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I'd also like to publicly thank Sue Lee. Sue, raise your hand, please, for helping out here. I'd also would like to introduce a new member of the Asia program staff, Bryce Wakefield. Bryce, raise your hand. Bryce has come all the way from New Zealand to join our staff. I hope that you'll introduce yourself with him as you go leave here today and get to know him. Don't forget, copies of this book are on sale immediately outside the door. Thank you for being with us today, and if you'll join me in thanking Bruce Dixon.